tend to like the smaller, intimate venues. 400 people or less. It just seems there's more of a connection with a smaller, intimate venue. For me, the big difference is the business part of it. Even though there's always been a business part of it, just seems now all the clubs and all the venues are more interested in generating how much cash they can generate. So, especially in the UK, most clubs are offshoots of a bar. So the venue's business is primarily, liquor, and the bar, and the secondary is the music, which they use to attract people to come in to have them drink. So as where before, you have a club, which is a club, and the bar is just a way for the club to generate income. So it's a little different. I just thought back in the day it was more about the music than it was about the dollar. I think that no matter where you go, a club is a club. The general purpose is to provide entertainment and a release for people to go somewhere and forget about the problems they had during the day, or the odd job that they had to do. So I think that it's a universal way of just letting loose a little bit. To be honest, as much as I'm from New York, I'm a born and bred Bronx suburb guy. I came from humble beginnings. My parents, all they did was work. I was telling somebody the other day, in my house, we never went to a restaurant, we never went to a movie, we never went on vacations. We went to school, we came home, my parents were very strict. So venture into Manhattan was a big deal. When I was growing up listening to music in the late 60s or the 70s, I was heavily into, the bubblegum scene, in New York. Even the British stuff, the Buckinghams and Porgy and the Raiders, the Monkees and the Grassroots, and those kind of bands were the ones that I listened to when I was young, and then slowly started to develop a liking for the R&B stuff that was coming out of Detroit, the Motown sound and the Supremes and the Four Tops, and some of the stuff coming out of the South. So I made that transition from, I guess, the real pop culture into the R&B stuff. The thing with me, just to premise all, is I love all music. If it's good music, no matter what genre it is, whether it's rock, R&B, soul, gospel, country, if it's good, I like it. So I got a guitar, I started to play, and I did like Santana, but one of my favorite guitar players was a blues guitarist called Johnny Winter. Johnny Winter was one of my favorite guitar players, and I used to model my playing after him, and then Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton back in those days. But I didn't have the chops, As much as I thought that I played well, I wasn't good enough. It just seems ever since I was young, I wanted something to do with music. I didn't know.
What age were you when that sort of?
Probably around 10 years old, 12, when I started doing that. But for me, it was always people want to be a pilot, they want to be a doctor, they want to be a fireman. I wanted to have something to do with music. I didn't know what it was going to be, but I knew that I was going to go down that road. And I traveled the road, My first gigs were DJing in my father's bar. My father and his brother purchased a bar in New Jersey, I guess back in the late 60s, and they had a jukebox. And the problem was that most of the jukeboxes back in that era were not owned by the bar, but by a second contractor. So they would come in once a week and they'd put the 45s in, and each bar, what they would do was that there was quarters. What they would do is they would take the quarters and they'd paint them red. This way, when the guy came to take the money out of the till, I'm using the English term, till, any quarter that was red went back to the house. So what happened was that because At my father's bar, not that many people were filling the jukebox. The guy came and said that the jukebox wasn't making any money, so they had to take it away. That's where my father said, well, why don't you bring your little record player and you could play some music? So I took one of those little box record players, with the 45s, and I'd go in there and I'd play records for a couple hours every night, having no idea, what I was doing, but it was fun. When I first started to DJ and I realized that it was something that I wanted to venture into, everything was records, whether it be 45s or LPs. And what I ended up doing was I would solicit bars, which were the predominant location for music back then, and just say, hey, I'd like to come in and play some music. And I realized back then that most places didn't want to pay somebody to play, so I would just tell them I'll play for free, and that's how I developed my skills and my knowledge of music. I'd go into all kind of bars and say, hello, if you got a spot, I'm a DJ, like to come and play. And, a lot of guys would say, well, we got a DJ, if you want to come and play on Tuesday night, you're welcome to, but we can't pay you. So I slowly started to do that, and that's how I got into the DJing part of it. The first record and the defining moment of when I transitioned into doing something with the music was Eddie Kendrick's Date with the Rain. That for me will forever be the record that changed everything for me, because that record was 2 minutes and 32 seconds long. And I just loved that record, and when you were just getting into it, it was finishing. So the next thought was trying to figure what can I do to make it longer? And I had no idea. So I don't know how it came upon me, but I said, I'll go home, and I had a cassette deck, and I was using the pause button, and I'd play the record, and I'd pause it, and I'd start it again, and I'd let the pause go. And it took me a while, but I learned when to hit the button so that it would try to be as close to on time as possible. So I ended up coming out with almost like a 5-minute version of Date with the Rain. I interjected a couple of parts from another record because there was no really what we call breakdown in the record. So I picked some percussions from another record and stuck it in the middle of it. And to be quite honest, listening to it now, it's like out of place. But back then it was, I consider myself now, I was a scientist. I was trying to figure out, how to make it rain or something, It's just weird. It just sprung out a hole. It's almost like a dam just broke free. And it just inspired me to do a lot of things, where then I started to do these medleys where I got a reel-to-reel and a razor blade. So for me, it was, like somebody that's practicing a craft. I was just experimenting and seeing what can I do? What can I accomplish? With cutting the tape and having things repeat and just crazy things happening. So I came up with all these medleys, and next thing you know, I was visiting Sunshine Sound so often that the owner said, he says, if you want, he says, I could sell some of your plates here, and I'll give you $1 for every one I sell. So that started, then that was like, forget about it. I'd go home every day, I'd find another record that I'd want to do an edit on. And, the interesting aspect of that was that Sunshine Sound was located in a building called 1650 Broadway in Manhattan. And that building housed a lot of record labels, whether it was Red Greg Records, Midland International, Brass Construction offices were in that building. And all those companies had their acetates or their test pressings made up at Sunshine Sound. So I guess one day somebody came in, and the guy that owned the place, Frank, said, there's this guy, John Morales, that's doing these hot mixes that a lot of DJs are starting to buy. You should get him to mix one of your records. So I guess Greg told Frank, well, have him come down to the office next time he comes in, and, we'll see. So I went in to get a record done. I can't remember what it was. And he says, go downstairs to the 7th floor and to Red Greg Records and ask for Greg Carmichael. You know, so I went downstairs, I spoke with Greg for a few minutes, and he said, we're doing a record, come down Saturday, 5 in the morning. I'm like, 5 in the morning. He says, come 5 in the morning to the studio. Was NOLA recording, was on 57th Street. I ended up getting there early, probably about a good hour early. And I walked into the studio, and the singer, who not that I didn't know, but nobody knew at the time, was Jocelyn Brown. She was the one that was singing. Session was being produced by Greg Carmichael and Patrick Adams. And, after that, turns out that I was involved in Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair, which was Jocelyn's first big record, ended up being my first big record, and a record that ended up locking our careers together for some 30 years. So I was fortunate in the fact that I walked into a situation, and that was the first record I did, and we sold that record out of the trunk of Greg's car. He'd go, we did the mix, everybody liked it. The one big thing that helped was that Frankie Crocker, who was the big DJ in New York at WBLS, loved the record, he started playing it. So I'd drive with Greg to New Jersey, to the plant, and he'd go get 25, 50, 75 records at a time, and we drive all over the city, going to different record shops, selling 5 here, 10 there, 5 here, and creating a buzz. And that's how it all started. The beauty of it is that the way they made records back those days was they'd cut the 4 tracks. Then they'd take those 4 and they would bounce them down to 1. And then they'd record again. And they'd find the beauty of it is that some of these companies retained all these tapes. For example, I was working on a Marvelettes thing about 3 weeks ago, and my friend at Universal says, we have, the 3 sessions. The first session had the drums, guitar, and the vibes, and piano in separate tracks, but then they put the piano, the vibes, and the bass all on the same track, so we need you to align everything and give us a big... So I turned the 4-track session into like 12 tracks, because I was able to take all the stuff that was recorded, line everything up, and be able to really, so it's going to be interesting. I've done it a lot, but there's a Marvelettes box set that's coming out, which has a lot of old, rare, unreleased stuff. I have to be honest with you, I was always somebody that tried to cram as much stuff as I could in, and I learned through failure that sometimes less is more, because it allows what's there to really expose itself, create space. I had a long discussion with my dear friend Tom Moulton about the art of mixing and how we look at it as a 3-dimensional picture. You have to look at it as from the width part and the depth, so it's like, where's the singer in relationship to the, so there's a relationship that everything has to have. And, last week we were driving to go meet a friend of ours, and I kind of just looked over to him. I said, you know what? I says, we're good at what we do. We've been doing this a long time because we listen to what other people are doing, and they have no clue as to what instruments should sound like. They have no training. It's just a guy with a computer. And, I've taken a lot of slack, because I'm a little critical of some of this stuff. But I tell people, I says, you can't jump into the water till you learn to swim. You need to learn a little bit about what the craft is and what the stuff is supposed to sound like. You just can't jump in and do a mixing because 2 guys tell you it sounds great. Like they say, you can't believe the hype, because at the end of the day, like with me, if it's a bad mix, it's a bad mix. Back when I was starting in the early 80s, when I was doing all the studio work, I was there every day. It was like a job. whether I was supposed to be in the studio or whether I wasn't, I would always show up. I'd sit in every session, as long as they would let me in the room, I was there because I wanted to learn. One of my biggest influence was an engineer called Bob Blank, who worked at a studio called Blank Tapes New York, where I did most of my early work. And I would sit next to Bob and I would watch everything he did. Every time he touched a knob or moved the fader, I would sit and I would try to understand why he did what he did. And that's how I learned my craft, just sitting there and watching him. And this was back in 1979, and I did not transgress from somebody sitting next to the engineer to being the engineer until 1984, when I made my first trip to the UK. My first trip to the UK, I came to mix a track for Ian Levine at Trident Studios in Soho, and I walked into the session, and I said, well, where's the engineer? And the guy looked at me, he said, we were told you're the engineer. So I just sat there and, like sometimes you're in a situation and it just comes to you, say, this is it. All those years that I sat there and watched and, did partake, in the engineering aspect, now it's my turn to graduate into doing it. And that's when I started doing my own records and I finally realized I can do it. I'm good enough. I did the session, I listened back to the tapes, I was happy with my work, and I got the confidence, so now I could go anywhere in the world by myself and do the job on my own. I didn't need to depend on somebody else to execute my ideas. Now I was comfortable, I could go in, and I was totally responsible for it. So my adage has always been that if I walk out of a studio knowing that I put 100% of me into the work, that even if somebody doesn't like it, I could be satisfied with the fact that I know that I put my best effort in, because, music and art is subjective. Everybody hears and sees things differently. But as a professional, whether it be a photographer or a videographer, if at the end of the day that that's your top-notch job, you could deal with somebody saying, hey, you know what, I didn't like that record you did. I said, well, it was a good record. I did the best I could on it, and I can't speak for the reason that you don't like it. It's like you could do a film and say, it's one of the best things that I've done. And all of a sudden, some guy says, oh, I hate that, Or you're standing in a crowd. This is a good one, and people are talking about you, because they don't know who you are. Says, oh, that record sucks. Oh, my God, and you're sitting there, you're saying, I know that I did a good job. And I learned that because there was one record, I was sick. I wasn't feeling well, and I left the studio and I rushed it. And I learned that anytime somebody criticized that mix, there was nothing that I could say about it, because I knew I left it short. And I promised after that session that I would never do that again. So, I've had mixes that's taken me 6 months to do. So everything on my compilations, I stand behind, and I'm proud of all my work, because, if you, like I said, if you did 100%, there's no criticism that can take that away from you. There's certain artists that I've always wanted to work with. Back in the mid-'80s, my partner, who was the other half of the Eminem, Sergio, we were approached by Motown because during the early 80s, when disco and the dance really started to boom, Motown had decided that they wanted to jump into the pool with everybody else. So what they did was they came to New York and solicited me and Sergio, who at the time were also working at a radio station. See, one of us wanted to head their A&R department at Motown. So we had discussed it and figured it'd be easier for Sergio to do it, because I was doing a lot of other things for us. I was running the business part, and I was more the technical person. So, and it was easier for him to do that. And what ended up happening was that we ended up mixing most of Motown's dance records, whether it be the Temptations, the Four Tops, whatever act, we were doing those records. The Commodores, and we had a lot of success with them. So what ended up happening was they flew us out to LA to work on some Temptation tracks at Motown in Hollywood. And I ended up meeting Marvin Gaye there. One night a session ended up being a week before he got killed. And for me, I always wanted to work on his material. So in the mid-'80s, we got to work on one of his records, which was The World Is Rated X, which was kind of on the backside of his career before he went on to do the sexual healing and stuff. So a few years back, and we're going to jump here into about 2004, I had a dear friend of mine, Paul Simpson, who was doing some work for Motown, and he called me. He said, you still have all your gear? And I said, well, yeah, I still have my gear. I still have the passion. It's just for personal reasons and a lot of things that medical that went on, I just removed myself from it. He said, well, I have this mix to do, and I really don't have a place to do it. Do you think maybe I can come, maybe we can do it together? And I said, yeah, come on. I was like, okay. So he came down, and it was off of Marvin Gaye's Hear My Dear album. It was called Funky Space Reincarnation, which was a great tune. And what ended up happening was Paul came to the house, and we started doing the mix. And during the process, it's like, I use that phrase, it was like the dam just opened up, and I realized that I had all this suppressed stuff, all this suppressed energy related to the music that now was starting to come out. And just a chain of events happened. Paul's parents got ill. He had to go away. So I had to finish the mix. In turn, the head of A&R there, a fellow named Harry Weinger, lived not that far from me. So one day he calls, and we're discussing different aspects of it, and he says, I wish I can, put my hand on the phasers and just show you what I'm talking about. And I said, come on down. You're 15 minutes away. So he came to my house. We fixed what it was, and we were having dinner, and, he looked over at me. He says, you know what? He says, I got a perfect project for you. And I said, what's that? He says, I'm getting ready to do a box, limited edition of Marvin Gaye in our lifetime. All the unreleased and the history of these tracks. So I was like, okay. And that just started it. When I first started, it was all about the musician. You get a bunch of musicians together, and in a cohesive unit, they'd make some great music. And then as a person that my specialty was mixing, my job was to take all those elements, balance them out, and get the best of what their performance was. In the mid-'80s, when it was the beginning of the computerized, when we started to integrate the computers with music, we still needed the musicians, but now everything was being recorded into a computer, and to a certain extent, you almost had no more mistakes. Because it was being quantized or it was being fixed as it went in. So you had a certain mixture of live musicians with some computerized stuff, which is fine. As time has developed and the computers have taken over pretty much the world, the accessibility to music now is more for the masses. You don't even need to know how to play in order to make music. You can buy a program, you can buy prefabricated drum loops and beats and stuff, but the thing that separates me from the way that a lot of people work is that I like to integrate real musicians and music with the electronic stuff. So, for example, if I'm mixing, if I'm being asked to mix a Marvin Gaye track, or any track that was recorded with live musicians, I always keep elements of the original recording.
So you've
Because-
got the basic tracks
Right.
split.
So I keep the original basic recording because that's what gives it its life, its movement. You know, music nowadays in a computer is very regiment. It's just, if it's 120 beats per minute, that's what it is. It doesn't vary, it doesn't change. Where the way that I work is, I don't make the music work to my time, I work to the music's time. So the way that I work is if I'm taking an old track, of which there are quite a few on my compilations, if I want to add anything to it, I add it to what they did. A lot of guys take the tracks and they put them in perfect time, so it's easier for them to do what they do. I work the opposite, because I believe that part of the magic of that music was the fact that it moved.
Yeah, it was in time and then it was out of time.
It was either, it was 120, it was 125, it was, whatever the band was feeling at that moment, that's where the music was going. And that's part of the reason for me that a lot of those records were great, was because of that. So I never want to be the person that takes that away from it and just makes it so mechanical.
No, because we, when I was at the BBC, we put a click track on Tomorrow Never Knows. That never stays in time. But that's what makes it what it is.
Right. Now, granted, many of the musicians did play the click tracks as a reference point to not vary that much, you know, but they always did. And there were drummers, Earl Young, one of the famous Baker Harrison Young rhythm section of Philadelphia, hated click track. He said, if you don't know how to play in time, you know, click track ain't gonna help you, you know? And he's one of the great R&B and dance live drummers. You know, that rhythm section for me is one of the greatest rhythm sections of all time. I think the fact that my career has spanned so long, and I'm grateful that I've been able to transcend every one of these eras and be able to adapt to what's happening without losing my roots. You know, and it's not about selling out, it's about adapting and trying to stay current, but still carrying my torch for the music that I love. And I love that because at my age, the music needs to keep me young. So I DJ, I go out there, and it's not about my age, it's about the music. So I always tell people, I says, you know, don't look at who I am, look at what I do. You know, don't think that because I'm, you know, 58 years old or whatever age I may be, that that's going to reflect on what my work's going to be.
If you looked at an album in a shop and you saw the cover, you listen to music, but you can't guess the age of the person who's behind it.
No, and most of the times the
You
picture,
accept it for what it is.
you know, you bring up a point. The funny part is that back in the 80s, 90% of those covers did not reflect who the artist was. It had nothing to do with the artist. Pictures of people that had just, you know, picture some guy walking down the street. You know, I remember when we did the record with Jocelyn Brown that the label put out an album with some girl on the cover. Nobody knew who she was. When I think about young people who think that music should be free, is I think about people living at home with their moms and not having any sense of reality or responsibility. I was getting ready to write an article, which is called Brother, Can You Spare a File?, which is a direct result of a phone call I got a few months ago from a guy who called and said, can you do me a favor? Can you send me this mix that you did? So I said, no problem. So I emailed him a link to go purchase the track. He calls me back and he says, no, he says, I didn't want to buy it. He says, can you just sell it to me? And I said, dude, the track is 99 cents. You're telling me that you're not willing to pay 99 cents for a song which you claim you want to play, whether it's for your own personal enjoyment or to go DJ or whatever. I says, I am very opinionated on this matter. I says, because I love music. I says, but the thing that hurts me the most is, another example is, I'll go to a club on a Friday night, and right around 10:30, a guy will come up to me and says, John, I'll see you later, I gotta go. He says, well, why are you leaving so early? I gotta wake up in the morning to go to work. And I sit there and I say, this is one of the most talented musician producers that I know, and the guy cannot practice or work his craft because he can't make money to support his family. You know, it's just like so sad. I mean, I have to say I'm very opinionated about this because I don't believe that the music should be free, because what is going to happen when everybody has to stop making music because they can't pay their bills? Then where are you going to get your enjoyment from? You know, it's like telling people, oh, well, we want to go to the movies, but we don't want to pay for them anymore. You know, it's just, it's ludicrous to think because we have the ability, because of the computer, to download and share and pass files back and forth, that we shouldn't pay for them. That's like walking in a grocery store and saying, I need a carton of milk, I'm just going to walk out of the store with it. When you get up at 5 in the morning to get on the train to go to your job on Friday, will you tell your boss, you don't have to pay me, I had a good time this week? And when your mortgage company or your landlord comes on the first of the month and says, I need 200 or 500 or 1,000 for the rent, how are you going to pay for it if you're giving everything for free? That is the part of it that people have a hard time understanding. They just think, oh, we'll just, you know, we'll just download it. And the guy said, well, I'll just find somewhere and download it. I said, well, then do that. I says, on Friday when you get your check, and if it's short, I want you to just walk out of your boss's office and say, don't worry about it. It just doesn't happen. So it should apply to everybody. If people want to earn a living doing whatever they choose to do, then they should allow other people to operate likewise. You know, if I want to be able to continue to make great music and entertain people, then I'm going to have to be able to provide for myself and my family and have a place to live.